Part 1. Mortal Refrains. What did I do to deserve this? What did I ever do to deserve this? Oh, Steve, the pain is indescribable. I never thought it would end like this. I never thought I'd end up like this. My dad was dying. Or was he? If somebody's still alive, it's hard to know for sure. He was definitely in a bad way, a bruised and battered, if still breathing corpse, his blood-shocked eye sockets welling up with tears. I thought I'd never see you again. I have no idea what he was seeing when he looked at me. Some familiar phantom amid the ghostly blur, buzz, hum, and occasional clatter of Ward B2, not B1, B2. And he didn't want to be here in B2. He didn't want to be anywhere but his own home, his own house, where he'd lived for over 50 years, an Englishman's castle. Everything will be better once he gets home. He wasn't ready for this just yet. He's got stuff to take care of, all that stuff in his closet. And he needed to pee so badly, but he couldn't. They'd shoved some kind of catheter up his private part. I need to piss so badly. He writhed and moaned and groaned and wept, and I held his hand and gently massaged his scalp. I bet you never expected to see your dad like this. But you're still me dad. And you didn't do anything to deserve this. It's just life. It happens to everybody. You're 86 years old. You deserve to be helpless. Nobody's going to begrudge you it. You just have to let it go. What else does one say to a dying man in indescribable pain? You have to let it go, Father. All this mental anguish just adding insult to injury. You have to let it go. I have no idea what it feels like to let go of something when you know you may never get anything back ever again, because there did not seem to be any returning from this. Not in any shape or form I could imagine, not in any shape or form I would want to imagine. Whatever force was compelling this critical juncture, there was no way I could wish him to have to face up to it again. It may as well be now, Dad, in B2, before it gets any worse. But if his mind still wasn't at peace... And suddenly he broke wind. Several times in quick succession. His body relaxed. "I'm just a dirty old man," he said, a faint flicker of thin-lipped humour. "Give us a kiss." So I kissed him on the lips, my cheek brushing against his 2-day-old man stubble. "I love you," he said, for the first time in my conscious memory. "I love you too, Dad." I guess he'd managed to take a pee, or maybe one better, maybe he'd moved his bowels to a much better place. I didn't pursue this possibility, figure, hey, I'm going to let the sheets soak that one up. Besides, there were professional people around in Ward B2 to deal with such things. Some crisis has obviously passed and he wasn't dead yet. That feels nice, he said, my hand stroking his scalp. I feel like a dog, or a baby, I thought, welcoming any benevolent touch without questioning its motive or morality, simply trusting to its benevolence. Helplessness seems to be a prerequisite condition for innocence. He looked at me through drying eyes. "So how are you doing?" "Well," I thought to myself, it could be worse. I was listening to this interview on radio, public radio, NPR, with this guy who was building a time machine, a real time machine, not an imaginary one. He was a physics professor, a real physics professor, and he'd written a book about it, a real book. This wasn't a movie, though. Apparently, some movie director had optioned the rights to the book, I assume, not to the time machine, because as far as I was understanding it, he hadn't quite built the time machine yet. He'd just pretty much mastered the theory. Otherwise, he might not be around to pitch his book or watch his movie being made. He'd probably already seen his movie. He'd be off somewhere in the past or the future, checking out the realities of history and science fiction, taking notes. So when he returns to rejoin us in our relatively primitive present, he can duly enlighten us with his metaphysicalized wisdom. Maybe they'll give him a ticker-tape parade down Broadway. Excerpts from his movie flashing up on the big screen in Times Square. Hell of a show, ladies and gentlemen. Hell of a show. This man has been where no other man has been before. Not without dying or not being born in the first place. Back to the beginning and forward to the end and all stops in between. This man has achieved the impossible. which, of course, if you think about it, can't be possible. It must have been possible all the time. We just hadn't wrapped our metaphysics around it yet. There's a time for everything. And this must be our time for travelling through it. And in time, it'll be as common occurrence as catching a cold before a cold catches you. This is no pie in the sky, ladies and gentlemen. No more than cars and airplanes were to guys who walked around wearing wigs and knickerbockers. No more than movies were to the Grimm brothers or piecework and conveyor belts were to the Seven Dwarfs. Progress demands that eventually we'll all be able to do everything at any time. We can go back to the beginning and see what nothing really looked like, where something actually came from, and forward to the end to make sure all this effort and ingenuity is worth it and not just a waste of fucking time. Of course, as any imaginative person worth their imaginary salt will tell you, we're already travelling through time. From birth to death, cradle to grave and beyond, and possibly back again, we're already in a movie. We move around in it as freely as we like to imagine we do. We're just not sure who the target audience is, or if we're ever going to make our money back, or who's playing the starring role. A real actor playing a real physics professor in a real movie, or just somebody who imagines they are. Which is the only way I'll get the part, because I'm not a physics professor, and I couldn't act my way out of a paper bag, never mind a time loop. I have enough trouble with reality as it is, which could change at any time. With the drop of a bomb, the flick of a switch, some inexplicable surge or lapse of energy, or some random maverick time machine landing on top of me while I'm taking a nap at the beach could totally shift my perspective on how much time I have left on this planet Earth. I may never know until I see me finished movie, or take a trip on a time machine. I could go back to the day I was born. That might really give me a handle on what life's all about. 3 months previously, I'd gone back to visit my parents in England from America. I'd travelled through space and time. I'd passed through a time zone. I'd lost 5 hours of my life. Of course, I knew I'd get it back on the return trip, because time is like that. You don't really lose it. You just put it on your credit card. My sister had forewarned me on the telephone about me dad's altered physical appearance, but still, it was a hell of a shock when the front door opened and this tiny skin and bone creature in oversized jeans and suspenders stood there in a little white T-shirt, vest and slippers, these thin white tousled wisps of hair clinging to his scalp for dear life. A skeleton with glasses on, fragile as a saliva web. You could have knocked us both over with a feather, me dad, literally. Apparently his liver was fucked up, couldn't handle the bile. His belly would bloat up. He'd have to go into the hospital. They'd drain it out, but then his belly would just bloat up again. The day before I arrived, they drained out the bile. It looked like they sucked all his meat out with it. I think the only muscle he had left was focused in his toe bones, the only thing standing between him and total collapse. He could barely manage a shuffle, never mind a walk. Suddenly my mum was starting to look rather sturdy and vibrant. "I wish I could lose that much weight," she said, without a trace of irony or malice, maybe just a hint of mischief. Because at various times in their marriage, apparently, my dad had given her a hard time about getting too fat, and the complex had gone deep, no matter how much weight she lost. And now she was going demented. Suddenly she could roam freely over her resentments, and my dad's past frailties as an emotional support system. There was one do, she said. There was one do. He wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't stand next to me because he didn't like my hairstyle. Said it made me look like a tat. At least I don't snore like a pig. There'd been a definite power shift in their relationship over the past few years. Because my mum was losing her mind, but she hadn't lost her sight or her hearing or her will to live. My dad's was waning rapidly. And her recall may have been generally random, but every now and then it was fiercely incisive and fearlessly expressed. One time my dad shuffled into the room and he's looking down at her and he asks her if she knows who he is. Well, she gazed up at him for several seconds. "No, who are you?" He shook his head and went to sit down. Of course, as soon as he sat down, she turned to me. "We've only been married for 60 bloody years, silly old bugger." Of course, he didn't hear that. He didn't hear half of what she said, and the other half made absolutely no sense at all. Even if it did, he didn't have the energy to bother to respond. His wit was dried up. She had him by the balls, which I assumed had also dried up. I'm not a man anymore. That was his new mantra, facing up to reality, because he hadn't lost his mind. He just pretty much lost everything else, including his wife. They'd been sleeping in separate bedrooms for a while now, so she wouldn't roll over onto his delicate bloat, and she could make her nocturnal dreamtime meanderings without having to wake him up. But it was hard not to feel like somehow she'd broken free. After 60-odd years of being Mrs. Bellwood, she was now her own separate entity. She didn't even have to wash her own dishes up anymore. Her apron strings had been loosed. All she had to worry about now was tripping over him, or tripping over me dad as he crawled around on the carpet, looking for the battery to his hearing aid, this tiny, minuscule gadget without which his world would be a slow-motion Charlie Chaplin movie without the piano accompaniment, terribly out of focus. Even with his magnifying glass, his city lights had been desperately dimmed. He had to kneel down on the carpet, 6 inches from the TV screen, to catch a fleeting glimpse of a world going off that wasn't just in his own head. He seemed more at home on the carpet. As soon as he sat in his armchair, he'd collapse into this chin-dropping, gaping Maud stupor. He'd keep apologizing to me for having to go upstairs and lie down. Practically deaf and blind, he couldn't carry on a conversation now for more than a few sentences at a time. That Christmas I called my sister's house, where the family gathered for Christmas dinner. She told me my dad wasn't even there. He'd stayed home alone, by himself, in bed. Didn't want to put a wet blanket on the proceedings. And that's when I suspected something might be getting seriously terminal. So I upshifted my scheduled visit, and the day before I arrived, he'd gone into hospital at his own request. He needed professional attention. And my sister told me they'd given him some medication to ease the discomfort, and it had deranged his mind. No sooner had he entered Ward B2 with these 5 other blokes in various stages of geriatric disintegration, he had this irresistible urge to deliver a morale-boosting speech. I'd like to thank everybody for coming here tonight. Weather's not that good, but we're here, and that's what matters. And I know if we all pull together, we can really get the job done. Now my daughter would like to say a few words. Just sit down, Dad, for God's sake. Apparently my daughter doesn't want to say a few words. Come on, Mr. Bellwood, it's time to tuck you up for the night. They had to call my sister back to the hospital a few hours later to help calm him down. He'd been wobbling over by the window, banging a cup of water on the sill. And the old bloke in the nearest bed told him to stop it. Me dad threw the water in his face. So the old bloke whacked him with his walking stick. The nurse had to intervene before there was a full scale of muscularly depleted rumble. Do not go gently into that good night, Dad, and keep a walking stick handy. Or a time machine, so you can zip back 40-odd years, have a good punch-up with a full deck. Assuming, of course, that your timing doesn't go back with you. I mean, you don't want to finish up 86 years old in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, caught in a sudden downpour at the Battle of Taunton Fields. I thought this was the winter of my discontent. Who's discontent? Who's that strange-looking creature in those ridiculous pyjamas? Must be some ancient sorcerer, sire. Should I chop his head off? Hey, I'm a respected physics professor. Besides, I haven't really been born yet, so you won't miss your head then. Chop his legs off too and feed him to the wild boars. Now, where were we? Northumberland, approaching the castle of York, my lord. Have I got time for a sandwich? Well, the Earl's over there just inventing one. Seminal moments in the history of Western civilization. So I guess we'll have to travel through time while we're somewhat in our prime, right? Or build our machine out of super-condensed hybrid steel with anti-tank trimmings and a little periscope so we can witness time folding and unfolding with impunity. And we really need to do our homework because, let's face it, there are a lot of warnings to manoeuvre. Not to mention the pox and the plague of locusts. Jesus, life gets complicated once you start elaborating on its basics. Speaking of Jesus, I read this short story once when I was a teenager in a national newspaper science fiction competition. And the winning entry was about time travel, set sometime in the future, when it was as common as a package deal to Cancun. And one of the hottest tickets at the time was a trip back to the crucifixion, leaving from Lourdes to get you in the mood. Brief stopover in Bethlehem to witness the first Christmas, check out the Magi, a lot smaller than I imagined. If it hadn't been for them camels, they would have looked like 3 jippos from the caravan side down the road. And that stink from that stable. You could smell it a mile away. We had to watch from the hillside with the shepherds. They thought we were stray sheep, because we'd been dressed up in these woolly jumpsuits. We spent 2 hours learning how to bleat, because you have to blend in. Then it's fast forward 30-odd years to Jerusalem. Don't have to pack anything, no luggage. Everything provided, especially the clothing, because you needed to be sartorially in tune with the times, otherwise things could get really freaky. And you're given your list of instructions. We want you to throng the road to Calvary, and every now and then punch your fist in the air and scream, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" in Aramaic, which can be a bit of a tongue twister if you come from Doncaster. Of course, this one guy, there's always one in every group, right, needs to explore off the beaten track. I think he was looking for a restroom, and he realises all the locals not even attending the executions, just them tourist time travellers. Crucify him! Crucify him! Most of the guys are down the pub, talking sport and politics. Galilee United for the cup. These bloody Romans build us a few roads, they think they own the fucking world. And the women, all the women are at home cooking up the couscous. They kept the kids inside for the day, so they don't have to witness all these poor buggers getting strung up on wooden crosses. Seems a little harsh, a little over the top, especially for that guy who didn't seem to do anything, really. He just went around telling everybody to love each other. Talk about the punishment not fitting the crime. And there were all these bloodthirsty motherfuckers throwing the road to Calvary. Must be imperial plants. Not a lick of conscience or compassion between a lot of them. They should be stripped and ticketed and sent back to purgatory where they belong. Which, of course, we are after the resurrection and the finale ascension. Half an hour in the gift shops, little strip of shroud, couple of dozen wooden splinters, $10 a pop, something to pass on to your grandkids. A hell of a show. It was a hell of a show. It was like you were really there, witnessing our Lord experience his final anguish and come out with a smile on his face, a halo round his head and able to bloody levitate. Shame about the food, just bread and fish all week. And that wine tasted like cat's piss. I think the grapes had gone off. Still, all in all, an experience not to be missed. Next year we're going to do the 10 Commandments. Apparently you can bring your own booze and your dancing shoes, because I'm told there's a hell of a party before things get really, really serious.